Thank you so much, everyone, for joining in on time. First and foremost, I should start with a few disclaimers that I'm definitely not an expert, a legal expert. I am a practitioner who has been, over the last 2 decades, been affected by the regulatory ecosystem and the labor laws, and hence have started taking keen interest in the subject. And hence, yeah, I mean, I'm speaking to you today in the capacity of someone who's a curious learner about this subject and who understands the impact that the process of labor reform can have in the economy. I think first and foremost, please understand that this today in the next 90 minutes, we're attempting to give you a crisp summary of 4 labor codes, which actually are almost 400 pages in volumes in terms of the details of it. So we are trying to kind of summarize it to the best of our abilities to give you an easy to understand view of what's going on really. And how does it impact employers? How does it impact the overall ecosystem of all the stakeholders, right? So I'm going to take you through a deck, and I think I would encourage you all to send in your questions. Please use the Q&A tab because that's a tab that I will be monitoring. And I would request you not to put in your question on the chat box. Please do it, send it in the Q&A. And as and when questions come to your mind, please do send it to us. And if we are keen to finish this in 90 minutes, and hence I may not be able to take all your questions, but I'll try and address as many as possible, but we're always available. We can take those questions offline as well, okay? So just give me a moment. So just to set the context for all of you, I think the 21st century reform agenda of our labor laws essentially was started around 2002 by way of the Ravindra Verma Committee recommendations. So he was chairing the National Labor Commission at that point of time. And along with a team of 10 experts, he came out with some extremely pertinent logical suggestions. As a matter of fact, it's part of his initial set of recommendations wherein he suggested that our labor laws should actually be comprised under 5 buckets. His recommendations were 5. He had uncoupled welfare and safety, if I recall correctly. But I think that's essentially the starting process. And I think over the course of time, I think in 2005, Team Lees, we came out with India Labor Report. And I was recently joking that the same India Labor Report, if I would have just changed the cover and made it India Labor Report 2020, pretty much would have remained relevant. But I'm so glad that it's no more necessary. I mean, we are a tad late on this, but I'm happy and I'm pleased that we've gotten started. I'd like to, many of you might already have seen these 2 infographics. Essentially, this tries to capture the complexity of India's compliance ecosystem, of which labor is a very important component. I think what we're struggling with are the impact of multiple laws with multiple definitions, the impact of multiple enforcement authorities, and the multiplicity of registrations, returns, and so on and so forth. So what we have seen is that out of this vast compliance universe, almost 30% of the compliances pertains to labor, almost 47% of the 30% of the acts pertains to labor, almost 47% of the compliances pertain to labor, and almost 46% of the filings pertaining to labor. So I think labor has a big role to play, and hence not just in terms of unleashing the true potential of the economy, but also in terms of improving our attractiveness as a country where it's easy to do business. So in this context and background, I think today we are at that stage where we have now legitimacy across the 4 labor codes. The first one, we got the necessary legitimacy at about a year back, and the next 3 essentially in the recent times, I think a couple of weeks back, we got to know that yes, now these are legit documents, and the future course of our labor law agenda essentially would be driven through these 4 codes. So just to give you a snapshot what they mean, essentially 29 of the 44 central labor acts have gotten subsumed under the 4 labor codes. The 4 labor codes being the codes on wages bill, the social security code on social security, OSH or occupational safety and health, and the code on industrial relations. I think it's very important for us to understand why is this consolidation important for us. I think if the data hasn't amply captured to you about the complexity that Indian entrepreneurs or corporates go through, nothing else probably can. I think it's important for us to reduce that. We have to, and we possibly can do it by way of reducing the number of laws in the first place. And I've noticed myself as a practitioner that actually, in effect, about 16, 17 of the central labor laws are the ones which are really important and the ones which were being closely used and monitored, and the ones which strike a balance between job creation and protecting the interest of workers. I think it's important for us to view it also from the lens of how attractive we are from the perspective of ease of doing business. So I think if we have the aspiration of being one of the top 50 countries worldwide in the ease of doing business, I think there's a lot to be done, and labor is definitely one such component, and a critical component. I think it's important to figure out how we can trigger large-scale formal employment generation, of course, side by side, without diluting the basic rights of an employee. Their rights to wages, their basic social security or health protection, safety protection, so on and so forth. And we cannot live anymore with the multiplicity of definitions, like terms like wages, workers, establishments. My God, I mean, in every act, you will see variations in that. So is there a scope for us to reduce all of that? And if there is, let's choose that path. And of course, the overall upsides of simplification, rationalization of the labor laws. So now I think some of the overarching benefits of the labor codes, I think this cuts across all 4 of them. Of course, you will see a reduction of compliances. And how can I say so? Again, just to share that, if I were to share certain data points to kind of numerically establish why I feel that cost of compliance definitely will go down. For example, if I were to look at the wage code itself, I think from the current state to the proposed state based on the new code, we feel that there would be a 67% reduction in returns and almost 92% reduction in registers. Each of them actually plow back as savings in terms of cost. IR codes, I think we are trying to figure out the exact assessment, so I can't share that. But on Social Security, we have, similarly, we're seeing 75% reduction in registration, 97% reduction in returns, and almost 90% reduction in the number of registers. Again, huge impact in terms of the administration cost that is likely to get reduced because of this. Occupational safety and health. Similarly, we see 75% reduction in the number of licenses that need to be procured, almost 90% reduction in registrations, 95% in returns, and 95% in terms of registers. So, and yeah, I think that in a nutshell tells you why I'm kind of confident that this is not, this is going to impact positively most employers. Also, we are seeing elimination of high costs of claims to beneficiaries. We're seeing the upsides of having one license, one registrations, and one return, like which I just shared with you a while back. And also the fact that there's going to be a single authority for all implementations. All inspections, facilitations is going to be web-based, going online. No inspector or facilitators can land up in your, start a prosecution proceeding without actually giving employers and organization ample opportunity to correct if there are any gaps. We also feel that there are certain leeways and flexibilities in when imprisonment clauses kick in. Unskilled workers, Section 4 workers are essentially unskilled workers. That category of workers, they are not required to make any contribution to Social Security Fund. The cost of such a fund will be created, and the government is going to fund this particular, the Social Security Fund. There are various kinds of outreach schemes that have been kind of notified for unorganized and informal sector workers. Of course, we really have to see how the government plans to implement and execute it, because this is a hugely ambitious task. However, this essentially means that a larger number of our workforce will come under the ambit of the law, which is, from the point of view of the workforce, definitely a plus. And I think there is a clear indication that in any kind of employment, there has to be an appointment letter which clearly captures the terms of the engagement between an employer and an employee, and all other benefits and engagement models have to be captured. Across all kinds of workers, and without any kind of salary ceiling, salaries needs to be dispersed by the 7th of the subsequent month. We do believe that all of this also, a lot of the changes and in the long run are going to lead to more formal jobs. And the fact that for the first time, India's legislation framework has actually acknowledged gig work, the gig platforms, the provisions that are required, and the protections that are required. So just let's start with the wage code. And again, I'll request you that as and when, because this is the 4 codes we will be going through, hence if you have any questions, keep sharing them in the Q&A tab. So 4 of the old acts have been subsumed under this code: Payments of Wages Act, Minimum Wages Act, Payment of Bonus Act, and Equal Remuneration Act. One of the key highlights essentially is that minimum wages and payment of wages essentially captures all organized and unorganized sector. So the minimum wages is as applicable to the unorganized sector as it is to the organized sector, and all the terms of payments of wages, which means 7th of the following month. It also essentially gives more empowerment for the central government to come out with a national minimum wage. I think there is a recommendation of coming out with a zone-specific minimum wage, which the central government will determine. Personally, I am somebody who's not a big believer of the national minimum wage, but that's what's the mandate that's being picked up by the central government. Essentially, each and every employee have to be paid on time. Also, we're seeing that there is a greater emphasis on any kind of eradication of any kind of discrimination, not just in terms of wage levels, but also in terms of recruitments and transfers. So which I think is a welcome move from the point of view of the women workforce. We are also seeing that imprisonment only in cases of offenses committed repeatedly within 5 years of commission of the first or subsequent offense. Contract labor will have to be treated at par with the regular employees, whether it's by way of their compensations or benefits. We're also noticing, we also see the courts actually are mandating that the states cannot actually, unlike the current, set minimum wages lower than the national minimum wage for that particular region. There is going to be the entire process of inspection, which would be largely done through web-based channels, and technology will determine how, when, who lands up in whose office, or if they are supposed to first and foremost land up directly into any of your premises. And I think this is a good move in terms of trying to increase the jurisdiction and go beyond the current geographic limits using technology, because in any case, there is a challenge in terms of inadequate supervision and bandwidth when it comes to inspection. So I think this will definitely help. Also, deposit of all kinds of undisbursed dues with the government in case of a death of an employee or where there is no nomination already specified. I think also there is, throughout the 4 labor codes, we see great emphasis on digital modes of payment. For example, for contract labor disbursement, it has to be completely done through online bank transfers. There is a clear, again, ruling and a guideline that now OT rate have to be twice the standard wage rate, and state governments have no leeway on this front. So earlier there was a provision which allowed state governments to kind of come out with their own own versions of it, but I think now it's being set across the country. Now this is, I'm given to understand that many of you spent some time reading the earlier version of the code, the 2019 version of the code, sorry. And just give me a second. Yeah. So what we have tried to do is, because we saw a significant change in the 2020 final draft and the 2019 draft. So we have made an attempt to kind of let you know about the difference between the 2019 version and the actual, now the one which finally got passed. What we have seen, there are changes across coverage, inspection, penalties, there are changes across minimum wages or OT rulings, and of course around gender discrimination. So on coverage, what we have noticed is, actually I was chatting with one of the labor officials as recently as today morning, and he was saying that they themselves, while writing the codes and doing the necessary analysis, were quite surprised to know that there are almost more than 1,000 forms of minimum wages. So, which complicates matters, I guess, for industries, employers, and even for the administrators alike. So what we are saying is, by way of coverage, minimum wages now will be paid to all forms of employees. So there's different slabs and different kinds of schedules will be done away with. Provisions regarding payment of wages now applies to all employees, which means there is no threshold anymore. And bonus will apply to employees whose wages do not exceed a monthly amount notified by the central or the state governments. Even in terms of inspections, so things like surprise checks and you know, essentially the stuff that we were also experiencing in the past, where inspectors can carry out examination of persons and require them to give information among their other powers. I think all of that has been done away with. It's now essentially their role per se is getting transformed to that of being a facilitator, where they are meant to help organizations to improve their compliance standards. And the entire inspection process will be based on inspection schedule, which will be made available through our web portal, and they will follow the necessary steps as prescribed in the schedule. Also, in terms of penalties, we have seen that there have been different kinds of penalties across the different, whether it's minimum wages has different penalties, or non-compliance of minimum wages have different kinds of penalties, non-payment of wages have different kind, and similarly for bonus and equal remunerations. So it's been simplified to a large extent. Of course, the quantum of fines have definitely gone up. So if you're not paying somebody minimum wages, you will have to pay a fine of up to 50,000. And if there is a repetition notice of that offense, there is a jail term as well as some amount which has to be paid as penalty. Similarly, for all the other aspects of the, whether it's bonus, wages, equal remuneration, the penalty amounts have gone up, both in terms of the severities of the jail terms and so on and so forth. On minimum wages, I think what we have noticed is that of course, minimum wages fixed by the state governments cannot be lower than that which is being prescribed by the central government as a national threshold for that zone. On OT, like I explained, it has to be double. And of course, there is more emphasis on having no discrimination across wages, recruitments, and transfer for women. So I think some of the advantages which I wanted to call out, I think it, first and foremost, the wage code applies to all sectors of employment. There is no discrimination. There are no other separate codes which exist now. And I think the minimum wages, like I also mentioned, now applies as much to the unorganized sector as it does to the organized sector. Again, payment of wages, there's no threshold anymore, hence it applies to everybody. I think there is a grievance mechanism that has been set in place to avoid any kind of dispute and also can help reduce the litigation cost. Inspections shall be completely web-based in nature, or rather based on the schedule made available. There are, of course, going to be a single inspector that employers need to be talking to, and that's going to be a significant relief. Higher amount of penalties, of course, is one of the, I'm sorry, I'm going to come to the challenges a bit later. So I think from the challenges, one important one is in the definition of wages, it does not include house rent allowance. 50% of allowances paid shall be part of the basic wages for computation. Also, one challenge would be that a claim for payment of minimum wages could be made within 3 years, as against the prevailing provisions that claim can only be made within 6 months. That could be a bit of a challenge for organizations. Of course, higher penalties for any kind of contraventions. And the courts can take cognizance of an offense punishable under this code if a complaint is filed by an employee or a registered trade unions. This might be a matter of discomfort for our employers. Few of the things which these are questions that I have in which bothers me, but and that's why I've just put them as question marks, is that what's the process the central government is likely to follow in terms of coming out with these minimum wages across the zones, and the fact that states cannot or have absolutely no leeway to kind of work on these prescribed minimum wages. So just to move on, again, if you have any questions on the wage code, please start putting in your questions while I move on to the next code, which is that of Social Security. This essentially subsumed almost 9 of the old acts: employee compensation, ESIC, EPF, employment exchange, maternity benefit, and a few more. So I think the essential objective of this particular code is to extend the Social Security to all employees and workers, whether they, irrespective of whether they are in the organized or the unorganized sector. Also, what we have noticed is that even on account of your threshold, if you are not qualifying to be mandatorily having an ESIC or a PF registration or registrations under the code, you still have an option of voluntarily becoming part of these schemes, which is an aberration from the past. Also, the fact that now Social Security is going to be extended to gig workers and platform workers, and how, is something that we will see once the rules come out for same. I think the definition of employee is quite comprehensive and essentially will capture as many employees and workers that one can imagine. Of course, there is a process of electronic registration of employers, and I should call out that the government clearly is making significant effort to kind of digitize as the process of compliances as much as possible. It's a work in progress. I think they're far from perfect, but I'm sure that we'll get better. Also, there is a provision where the central government is going to set up a national security board for the unorganized workers. And similarly, state governments also will have the option of being able to create social security organizations within the state. Again, the government has empowered itself through the scheme to essentially come out with social security policies for gig workers. And they're also enabling a process through which they can be covered under the ESIC scheme. Now, again, how and all is something that we will have to watch out to see in the rules. Also, there is an intent to frame schemes providing for social security even for self-employed workers. Also, gratuity, payment of gratuity to fixed term employees, even on pro rata basis, has been mandated. So, which means even if the person has worked for less than 5 years or the exact quota that was earlier prescribed, they will be still entitled to gratuity. Just like I did for the wage code, I think there have been some significant changes. Just to give you a background that why am I spending time on taking you through the 2019 and 2020 version. After the first code, wage code, got notified, the 3 code also were on the verge of going to the parliament. However, they were sent back to the standing committee to kind of rework on them. Various views. Maybe some people must have felt that they were inadequate, there were gaps in it. Whatever it is, I think we see significant changes being done in the recent version of the code. So for example, in terms of Social Security Fund, in the earlier version, there were talks of giving empowerment to the central government and state government to kind of set up Social Security Fund. In the current version, the decision has been made that the central government is setting up a Social Security Fund and also allows state governments to do the same. And the fact that there is inclusion of, that we will include gig workers, platform workers in the, as part of the Social Security Fund, the coverage. The National Security Fund, I mean, this is essentially something which is new. It was not really there in the past. I'm going to take you through a little more details on it in the subsequent slide. I think I can skip the details now. Some of the provisions which have been added cuts across penalties. I think that you will notice across all the 4 codes that the penalties have become much steeper. Also, the composition of the boards. We're talking about the National Security Boards. So we are seeing that there will be greater representation in these boards from central government officials. So essentially, the overall number is now going to be 42 in the National Social Security Board, as against the earlier quota of 37 in the 2019 one. And similarly for the state ones, as against 34, the representation of state government officials, the overall size will, from 31, the size will go up to 34. And special powers now have been given to the government to make changes if any situations in future occur, like the pandemic, where the government can defer or reduce the employer-employee contribution towards Social Security, which I thought is an important inclusion. Also, from the perspective of gratuity, I think what we are noticing is that for journalists, in the 2020 version, there is a provision where journalists will be eligible for gratuity even if they do not complete 5 years. So from 3 years onwards, they are eligible. And of course, there are few provisions which have been completely taken off on appeals and escaped amounts. Some of the advantages, I think, essentially, if you're already registered under, let's say, for PF, ESIC, and so forth, you do not need another fresh registration under this code. I think we noticed that there is clear uniformity in definitions between the wage code and the Social Security code, and this has huge upsides. All filings will, of course, be electronically done. Fixed term method of engagement. There's much talk that has happened on fixed term employment. Essentially, fixed term employment has been was legitimized, I think, a couple of years back. And again, we see their inclusion and the fact that it's permitted across pretty much all levels with in all sectors, in all job roles. However, they have to be paid in every possible way. Wages, benefits, everything has to be at par with a permanent employee, including gratuity, for example. So pretty much everything that a regular employee is entitled to, this fixed term employee will also be entitled to. Introduction of a 5-year limitation period for initiation of an inquiry under the Section 7A for non-compliance under the EPF Act. This used to be quite a bit of a pain in the past, and I think this is again a big plus for employers. Also, the next one, which is essentially where the responsibility of updating Aadhaar to avail benefits on the Social Security have been clearly put on employees. And I think it's very important because as a practitioner of somebody who has been providing jobs to a lot of kids over the last few years, and since Aadhaar became a mandatory ask, I think the most difficult job for us has been to, just in order to get them covered and give them their due benefits, biggest struggle has been to kind of match the data that they provide at the time of employment with that what's available in the EPFO or the Aadhaar portal. So, and I think this is a very important inclusion, and hopefully this will put in a lot more discipline in the current process. EPFO and ESIC essentially need to, the way the code reads is that they will essentially become body corporates, which means they become like legitimate organizations, like corporates. And I think that would actually definitely lead to higher accountability. I think many of us believe that we've been hostages to EPFO and ESIC, but hopefully that would change with this new avatar of these two organizations. Generation of web-based inspection schemes, pretty standard. I think I'm not going to go through that over and over again. One important thing is that there is a proposal to enhance the salary limit for women employees under the ESIC scheme to 50,000 to facilitate payment of maternity and cash benefits. I think it's an important one. Many of you must have experienced or have read about the after effects of the amendments which happened to the Maternity Benefit Act, and how overnight India became one of those countries where 100% burden of 26 weeks of maternity benefit came onto employers. And the impact that it has had on women at workplaces. So I think this is an important one. I would have preferred if there was no limit or cap, but I think we would take whatever we get at this point. Labor welfare funds, so to take you through some of the challenges. So I think the labor welfare funds have not been merged with the code, and I think which means those additional compliances and burdens continue. Insurance cover for payment of gratuity has been made mandatory, leading to, that will definitely lead to blockage of working capital for employers. And dues towards EPF and ESIC contribution shall have first charge on the assets of the establishment. Also, the provision which the government sometime back came out, the follow-up amendment to the first set of amendments, the provision that the government will contribute 50% of the maternity expenses to women earning up to 15,000 have not been included. Also, the minimum fine for first-time offense is about, again, fines will be a bother. All fines have really multiplied in its impact. So I think that definitely will continue to be a bother. Okay, moving on to the other one, which is operational safety, occupational, it's not operational, sorry for that. Occupational safety, health and working conditions. I think it has subsumed 13 of the existing acts, and some of the key ones being the Factories Act, the Sales and Promotion, Interstate Migration, and Contract Labor and Abolition Act, some of the key ones. I think the basic objective of this act was to kind of provide a wide legislative framework to kind of secure benevolent working conditions for the workforce. Also, side by side, provide the much needed flexibility and to include provisions of the code through which enforcement of rules and regulations can happen by leveraging technology to the best of our. So I think this is again the comparison between the changes, and this one is significant and it's important to draw your attention to it. The 2019, we were talking about this being applicable to establishment which has, from the perspective of contract workers was applicable to establishment or contractors having 20 or more. It's that 20 has moved to being 50 today. Earlier there was, essentially there was prohibition of contract labor in perennial work. And there was some, I mean, essentially the terms through which you can include or not include contract labor, definitely we've seen a shift. I think there is a clear prohibition of contract labor in core activities. However, flexibilities have been created, which is by way of saying that if this contract labor were deployed even historically for normal functioning of the establishment, then even if it's core work, then it's allowed. Also, if it is an activity wherein you do not need full-time workers, even if it's core, to complete that task, you can deploy. And also if there is spikes, ups and downs in your business requirements, even if it's core work, you can have. So I feel that the government has created enough flexibility to ensure that as and when organization requires contract labor, even in core activities, they can do so. Earlier, this was not applicable to central and state governments. So now this applies to contract labor even for state and central governments. For example, factory, which is any premises from the perspective of the rules that apply to a factory and what is considered as a factory. And hence, what is their coverage under this particular code? So we see that whatever were the threshold numbers in 2019 that have been exactly doubled in the 2020 version, which should be a relief, especially for the MSME sector in a big way. Mines, for example, were excluded from the definitions of factory and construction. So we see that provision has been removed. Also working hours, I think it has been fixed in the 2020 version to be about 8 hours per day. And I think which is a welcome move. Women can pretty much work in any kind of job roles across all establishments. I think we've also already talked about the Social Security Fund. I think this is a big one. How this fund will get also funded is essentially all the penalties and the compounding of penalties which the government will accumulate will be utilized to kind of run this fund. Now, because this particular code has a lot of changes from the perspective of deploying contract labor, I think I wanted to share that what does it mean for somebody who's a principal employer or for an establishment. This becomes applicable to any establishment employing 50 or more contract workers and to every manpower supply contractor who have more than 50 workmen. All the welfare facilities for the contract labor have to be provided by the principal employer. Also, engagement of contract labor by a principal employer through a contractor without a license. And this license is different from the license that we have had in the past. I think this talks about a specific license that a contractor needs to procure, shall be deemed to be contravention of the law, which means that one cannot get away now with having contract labor without not working with a legitimate contractor who has a legitimate license. Also the fact, I mean, I've also already spoken to you about the fact that the code mentions prohibition of contract labor in core activities, however, have established 3 different criteria through which you can have contract labor even in core activities. From a contractor perspective, I think the contractor, essentially the most important thing that has happened is by way of how the licensing regime has changed. So let me capture that before I come to the specifics that contractors need to bear in mind. So essentially now contractors engaging contract labor in more than one state. So the problem was that if let's say we are a staffing organization and we have a partner organization establishment with whom we support with contract labor, they have offices across all the states. And in some cases, they have multiple offices across each of these states. So by law and by the earlier erstwhile provisions of the CLRA, we had to take a license for every premise where the number of overall contractual employee was above the threshold determined. That was an administrative nightmare, both for the employer organizations, because for every such premise, they had to give you a registration form. And for contractors, it's the same. And imagine for someone who's working with multiple organizations across multiple states, across multiple premises. And I think this essentially is a relief, because now contractors who operate in more than one state can seek one national license. And besides the national license to operate across multiple states, there is also a provision where one can seek work-specific licenses. No contractor is allowed to deploy workmen, contract labor, without a license. And the entire process of seeking and getting a license completely or renewed completely will be electronically done, and the license will be valid. This is something that we worked very tirelessly for. I think this is an outcome of a recommendation that we have given the government through our representative industry body called Indian Staffing Federation. I think this is a work that has considerable work has gone in terms of capturing these details since 2011. Inspiration for this was drawn from ILO Convention 181. India is a ratifier to that convention. So while we are not while we have never implemented it, however, we could actually draw a lot of inspiration to create a contract labor ecosystem, which is win-win for all concerned parties, as well as clearly states accountabilities for each stakeholder. From a contractor perspective, they are expected to intimate the authority every time they get any fresh order or their number of deployed workers or contract labor increases. So if one doesn't do that, it will lead to cancellation of the license. Contractors are responsible for payment of wages completely electronically, and they are mandated to inform the principal employer of that disbursement. Also, and I think that's an extension of how it has been in the past, that if contractor fails to make such payment, principal employers are held liable for the same. Also, it's mandatory now for contractor to issue an experience certificate to every contract labor. I think it's a great practice to implement, because it definitely helps these contract labor in the near future. Okay, so some of the, I think interstate migrant workers is an important one given the current context of the pandemic, and hence we see significant and pertinent inclusions. In terms of responsibilities of principal employers or establishment, I think facilities have to be provided by the contractor or by the employer engaging interstate migrant workmen. Medical facilities, checkups, ESIC and PF benefits all have to be extended to interstate migrant workmen. Also, there is a mandate now where employer has to pay journey allowance once a year to the interstate migrant for them to go back home and come back. Employers cannot sue an interstate migrant worker for recovery of any of his past liability on completion of employment, and his liability shall be deemed to have been extinguished. And also, what is appropriate role of the appropriate government? I think they are supposed to make schemes allowing for portability of benefits availed by the interstate workmen under the public distribution system. Also, the government will create helplines, grievance helpline for interstate workmen. There will be specific studies conducted by the appropriate government to kind of understand the health, the current state of affairs of the workmen. Also, there will be record keeping and an institutional record keeping process that appropriate government have to put in place. And I think this is something which has gotten attention more so because of what has happened over the last 3-4 months. So the fact that nobody really knew the extent of the tune of these interstate migrant workers, and I think this is essentially a move driven by what has happened in the recent past. Some of the broad advantages, I'm going to avoid making repetitions. I think definitely the fact that this is going to be a license that have to be procured by a contractor for a period of 5 years is an important one. And I think a lot of legal provisions have been strengthened and employees are also being held accountable to meet safety norms. So while there is added responsibility been put on employers to ensure that workplaces are secure and safe, I think there is clear responsibility being assigned to the employees as well. This does not apply to any apprentices. And some of the challenges that we noticed is that I think the extra stringent norms that have been set out to kind of safety norms that organizations have to invest in. I think MSMEs and large organizations alike will have to be prepared to have extra cost burden coming in from this. I think third point, I will try and address it a little later, but I think that's been addressed in the wage code. So I will come to that in a while. Of course, there are higher penalties for violations. And one interesting thing is that civil courts have been barred from hearing matters under the court. So one cannot approach the civil courts. You have to go to the higher courts if there are any dispute resolution that have to be made. And then finally, we come to the last code, which is the Industrial Relations Code. It essentially, this one is, of course, the hugely contentious one. Covers the Trade Unions Act, the Industrial Employment Act, as well as the Industrial Dispute Act. I think objective remains of trying to simplify and rationalize as much as possible to facilitate ease of compliance, to have a process of an effective process of enforcement using technology which enables transparency and accountability, and also to see if there is a possibility of reducing the multiplicity of definitions. I think one important thing which has happened from a standing orders perspective is that earlier the threshold of organization who needed to have standing orders for certain matters was for organizations who have 100 or more employees. That 100 has now been shifted to 300. So that's again an important change. Permissions from the government, I think a huge one, and I think very well debated across all forums, which suggests that if you were laying off 100 or more employees, you had to take permission from the government. That threshold now has been increased to 300. As a matter of fact, even before the codes, many state government had already made the requisite changes in the state labor laws to bring about to actually get this done. So I think, I was actually recently asked that, for example, the state government of Rajasthan is one of the ones who are at the forefront of making this change. So state government, Rajasthan made changes on this threshold. They also made certain important changes in the Factories Act, um, modifications in the way you get registered in this under the Factories Act. Essentially what happened is that the question that was asked is that, does that mean, I mean, did that mean that more and more organizations were laying off in the state of Rajasthan? What we noticed is that while there are no empirical evidence right now, at least the ones which are available on public domain, to suggest that the number of retrenchments and layoff went off at that point in Rajasthan. However, there is evidence that because of the amendments and changes made in the Factories Act, many the registrations under the Act went up. Now, that doesn't mean that more factories got created overnight in the state of Rajasthan, but what it essentially means is that many organizations which were not getting themselves registered or playing under the radar essentially felt that now they could come and get themselves registered. And that's essentially how formalization of enterprises start. So, but again, I think I'm making that comment based on the limited information that I have available. I think in terms, we've seen significant changes being done in terms of the powers of the government. I think, of course, overarchingly, we've seen that government has given itself more power to make changes, and relevant and pertinent changes which earlier used to go to the parliament. I think under this code, we have noticed that as a change from the 2009, that any kind of increase in threshold, the government is saying will be done through notification, through a process of notification per se. From a negotiating union, I think the 2019 version had mentioned that for you to be a trade union organization who has a place to be the sole negotiating union, you need to have 75% or more share of the workers as your members. I think that threshold has been reduced to about 51%. Also, in case there is no sole negotiating unions, in that case, essentially there will be a committee of sorts which will get created called the Negotiating Council, and any trade union who has 10% or more share can become members. So that threshold now has been increased to 20%. We have seen certain removal of powers as well, like provisions, like in terms of threshold powers and employee strength. Something which has been added is on account of disputes relating to termination of individual workers. So if there are any such disputes, the individual worker has the right to kind of raise an industrial dispute. And that, I think, is a change, again, critical change from the past. Some of the advantages, I think fixed term employment is now permissible across all sectors, job roles, but the benefits have to be at par with regular employees. Mass casual leave would be treated as strike, and employees facilitating employers to take disciplinary action. Threshold limit, which essentially has gone up for layoffs and retrenchment, where you needed government permission from 100 to 300. Greater use of technology to ensure that there is complete transparency. Even as much as possible, can we use technology to close disputes? I think I've also already spoke about the concept of negotiating council and how it's going to come into play, and how the constitution of it would be. There is also constitution of two-member industrial tribunal, which would help establishment to help settle cases. Like I mentioned a while back, that employees now can raise industrial dispute, and they actually can approach this tribunal to get their issues resolved at the earliest possible. Also, the fact that there is a prohibition of strikes without notice, we believe will definitely lead to higher productivity. I think some of the challenges I feel, I think the first challenge, essentially the fact that one needs to still go to a government after a certain point. Now it's just the way one looks at it. But anyway, there is still a threshold and one has to respect the threshold. There is a reskilling fund which has now been constituted. So when there is a process of layoff or retrenchment, so 15 days corpus have to be maintained, equivalent of the wages have to be created, and it will be an employer's cost to kind of give added help for retrenched employees to kind of get themselves reskilled. Personally, I have worked and I've recommended this. So while it might be challenging for employers, but I feel this is an important move to kind of help the, if organizations need the flexibility of being able to retrench and lay off, then they should be willing to make this little investments into the future of these same employees. Also, there is going to be much higher penalties, which definitely is going to impact the MSME segment in a big way. So I think that brings me to a closure. Trust me, this is a Herculean job to kind of try and summarize in front of you 400 pages into 20 slides. And pardon me if I've missed anything, pardon me if I've not captured some details, but we've tried to do our best. And hence I shall now open myself to your questions. Just give me a moment. I'll just stop sharing. Oh, wow. There's a lot of questions. So Maheshwaran, you're also on the call. If there are any questions that you can pick up and respond, do let me know. The code, which code, I don't know. Vijay Kumar has asked that this code, will it apply to the development sector? I don't know which code you're referring to, but I think the threshold limits, which have been clearly stated, tells me that this has got nothing to do with any specific sector. So there is no sector discrimination that we have seen have come into place. So this covers all companies, all enterprises, all establishments. The only thing that you need to watch out for is the employee threshold limits for you to know whether you come under that, come under a specific provision or not. Contract labor, does contract labor include contract employees of a service provider? Yes, it does. What are the major changes in gratuity to employees and workers? There are no major changes for any other, two changes. One is fixed term employees are entitled to gratuity on pro rata basis, and journalists are entitled to gratuity at 3 years instead of the 5 years. There is essentially, thankfully, the definition of workers encompasses workmen, supervisors, managerial, all together now. So the question, sorry, I'm kind of giving you the answers without telling the question. The question was, is the distinction between workmen, supervisory, managerial staff being done away? The answer to that is yes. A lot of industries have deployed contract labor in core activities. What is the way out? Where you already have been using contract labor, you can continue. That's how I have interpreted the law. How do we deploy contract labor if the count is less? Then you do not come under the ambit of EOSH code. How do we deploy contract workers if the count is less than 50 without license? Then you do not come under the purview of the code. So I would, I mean, essentially, just for everyone's benefit, I think the key elements of viewing the labor code would be coverages, essentially thresholds. You will see that there are clearly defined thresholds in terms of what becomes applicable to which organization, and thresholds largely are on account of headcount. I think that is something that you have to watch out to find out whether you are eligible for any of these compliances or not. Ideally, what I would like I would have preferred is across the 4 codes, if there would have been one threshold. But at the moment, it is not the case. There are deviations across different provisions, and that's what currently we'll have to live with. We know what are the non-core activities, so I don't know whether that helps in understanding this a little better. So there are about 11 areas, if I'm not mistaken, which have been clearly defined as non-core under the OSH code. So let me see if I can pull it up for you. Somewhere in the Act. Okay. I'll come to that. Just give me some time. I will give you those details. Somewhere it is there. Is there any timeline given to state government to frame their rules? No, I don't think there is any timeline given, but I would love to imagine that there will be adequate nudge from the central government to encourage. And given the current situation, it is to the advantage of the state government to kind of use this time. The timing is going to be everything to make those necessary changes. Given that we have seen greater delegation, legislative delegations and empowerment to the central government and the state government, I think they have all the flexibility and legislative backing to make those changes now. Normal wages is basic plus DA plus 50%. Is there, is this applicable to? No, I think the way you structure your wages is something that is not standard. So I think that definitely you have certain leeways. But wage, in terms of how you can do compensation or salary structuring, is a subject for a separate webinar in itself. Do migrant worker mean any type of worker from another state? Yes, that's exactly the definition. However, there is a wage limit that has been prescribed. So anybody who is voluntarily, like, okay. So essentially, if, for example, a migrant worker on their own are moving from one state to another state, the responsibilities of the employers remain the same. There is a wage limit which has been prescribed, if I have read the code correctly, of up to 18,000. Anyone above that will not come under the definition of interstate migrant workers. What are the implications to on-roll fixed term? There are no implications at all. I mean, you can have people on fixed term employees. Essentially, what that means is that there will be a start date and an end date to their contracts. And you have to pay them everything the way you pay a regular employee who does the same job. Does it mean that Working Journalist Act and the wage determination under the Act will be eliminated? They will be subsumed in the new Act. So essentially that particular Act stops to exist standalone, and it is part of the Occupational Safety, Health and Working Conditions. So the Working Journalist Fixation of Rates of Wages Act of 1958 is no more operational. Any limit on wages for paying interstate worker journey pay? I think this is 1 year. So you basically, from the time you deploy them, every year you'll have to pay them once. So I think you have to pay them once. So that's pretty much how it is. There are some of the answers to your specific questions will be far more detailed when we get the rules. How will we differentiate migrant and contract? There is a possibility that a contract employer can be a migrant worker. So then they are entitled to all the benefits of a contract worker as well as a migrant worker. Informal worker is somebody who definitely doesn't have an appointment letter or no terms of contract. They are engaged without any formal agreement. So they are a different category, and the way, while the codes aspire to kind of include unorganized sector workers, at this point of time, they are not even acknowledged as a worker. So, or they are not covered under any aspect of the labor laws. So the minimum wage is calculated as basic pay. Like I said, I think pretty much which exclusion of HR, everything else now is minimum wage. HRA, sorry. I understand that any worker who does not belong to the state where established, then that worker will be, yes, absolutely. But with, if that person earns 18,000 rupees or less. The recordings of this entire today's entire session will be available on our YouTube channel, on our Facebook page, and all other social pages. So we will definitely, and if you've registered with us, you will also have a copy of it being mailed out to you. When can we expect Karnataka government to give us wage cutoff for bonus applicability? I think, honestly, I don't think there is a timeline right now available, but Melanie, I'll get back to you on that. There's a lot of questions on wages and salary structuring. I'm happy to do a separate session just on that. I think more or less all your questions are in the same direction. So I think I just responded to one of them just a while back. What does the definition of workman change? Essentially, it has become all-encompassing, all-inclusive. So all those different definitions, supervisor, manager, all of that has been done away with. Everything now encompasses a workman. What is your take on constitutional aspect, especially on the center taking calls on laws on state subjects? The central government, if finally the government does what is permissible as per the constitution, and if the constitution allows the central government, and central government does have the requisite powers, I think they would. But I think, yeah, I think they definitely will. For example, but it won't be that it can be done only through a notification process. So for example, the fact that state governments do not have any leeway in terms of coming up with state-specific OT, through the code, the government has completely done away with that option. So now the central government has already determined OT will be twice the standard wages. So, and the constitution does allow them to, the constitution allows them to do it as it has been approved by the parliament. Given that workman definition has become all-inclusive, I think permission to retrench will cover all kinds of worker. But I think that's my inference, but we will have to, I will get into the details to come out with exact specifics on that, Devashi. Yeah, absolutely, Somesh. The point on status of permanent employees, essentially, if a contract staffing organization or somebody who is on job contract is offering their own permanent resources to a customer to get a task done, essentially they are exempt from the regulations of contract labor. So that's not really you're providing your own employees, permanent employees. Essentially what it means is you have an open-ended contract, they are being deployed. So hence the rules of the contract labor regulations or the OSH won't apply to them. The reason it was not really a concern, it was a question mark. So that point. So that's why I had parked it separately. Interesting question, Vijay. Can two different divisions of a company with less than 300 workers can be accommodated? Maheshwaran, do you have an answer to that? Can two different divisions of a company with less than 300 workers be accommodated in single premise as per the new code without taking government permission? Maheshwaran, do you have an answer to that? I haven't read anything specific on this, so I don't think I can comment yet. Maheshwaran, you have to unmute yourself if you're speaking. Okay, quite a few questions are being answered by Maheshwaran, so good, that takes care of it.
So if there are two divisions, both the divisions will be considered, located in the same place. Both the divisions will be considered for determining 300 workers.
Okay, which means the summation of them or distinctly?
It's a total of them.
Okay, fine.
If one division has 150 workers, they need not, to retrench these workers, they need not take permission.
Okay, hope that answers your question. What specific things organization in educational sector? I think all rules apply. I mean, like I said, that the code is not doing much, doesn't offer differential treatment sectorally at all anymore. So there is really nothing specific for that segment. Given that Anirudh, your question, does the provision regarding individual termination to be treated as industrial dispute include within its ambit corporate employees? Given that the definition of workmen have become all encompassing, it just includes everyone. That's the way I interpret it. Maheshwaran, at any point you disagree with what I just said, please do let everyone know.
Sure. I'm noting it down, and if there is any disagreement, I will immediately clarify.
Yes, because I'm going a lot also. I have to keep reminding you all that I'm not a legal expert. I am a curious student of the subject. So I am learning as much as I can. And I also make interpretations and inference based on where I stand. No contribution from workers in Social Security Fund. Is it mean no employees contribution? No, Social Security Fund is going to be distinct from EPF ESIC. It's a special fund which will be created for the unorganized workers. And there will be a national Social Security Fund, and then there would be state-specific Social Security Fund. So it has it is for the unorganized sector workers and the gig workers. What kind of experience certificate? Not principal employer. I think this experience certificate has to be provided by the contractor to every exiting contract labor. Leave encashment to be done. I don't think there is, I have noticed any changes to that. Maheshwaran, do you see any change in that? I don't think there is any it's not mandatory that it has to be done every year.
That's not mandatory. It depends on the employer's policy only.
Absolutely. what if contract workman works for more than 240 days? If you are deploying them through fixed term contract, so if a contractor is deploying contract workmen on fixed term contract, there's no anymore. The applicability of these 240 days and all have been completely been made redundant.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter now. And that's why even when you're deploying contract staff, they need to be deployed to fixed term contracts. Gratuity tenure for those who are not journalists, the current law remains the same for them. Except if you are a fixed term employee. If you're a fixed term employee, then it has to be paid to you at exit on a pro rata basis. States will, thresholds in their state rules. My assumption is that the state will have the flexibility of changing it. They may not make it unfavorable, is my assessment, but I could be wrong, to be honest. As a matter of fact, at the moment, the government in its rulemaking process is breaking their head in terms of how they will segregate the rulemaking capability that, or rather through rulemaking process, how they will empower even the state government. So what are the flexibilities, leeways, and that will be provided even to the state governments. Comments on PMPRI scheme, it is a scheme which has ceased to exist as of now, and there is no such indication that it is going to be revived. No, I think gratuity on pro rata basis is not applicable to an employee who has an open-ended contract. So I actually have shifted from the term permanent employee to say fixed term employees and open-ended contract and open-ended employment employees. Confusing. Yeah. Yes, I think does contract workers to be counted for threshold limit? My assumption is yes. Maheshwaran, do you agree?
Yes. Threshold limit contract workers to be included.
Okay. Our educational institute teaching faculty, again, it's about the construct of these institutes. The labor codes have not made any kind of exemptions, exclusions at this point of time. So. Yeah. I am trying to address as many as I possibly can. Will the model standing orders be applicable on organization having less than 300 as per the new guidelines? No.
Yes. Model standing orders would be applicable less than 300.
Less than 300 won't be applicable, na, Maheshwaran? That's the change.
Less than 300 model standing. They can go by the model standing orders. Yet to be notified, right? So it will be part of the rules. Model standing orders will be notified in the rules, will be listed and given in the rules.
Acha. Okay. Okay, so let's watch out for the rules then. Okay. Anyone else, you guys? I mean, do you think I should pick up any other questions which I'm missing? Because there are over 100 questions now. Wait, 1 second. I have to figure out a method to this now. Yes, if you want a separate session on salary structuring, we will do it soon sometime. Statement that Contract Labor Act is applied for employing more than 50 workers is grossly incorrect. I'm actually just referring to the OSH code. Essentially, contract labor now has got subsume the CLRA, Contract Labor Regulation Abolition, which says that establishment of contractors employing 50 or more contract workers now come under the purview of this. Yes, Prerak, I know you have a lot of questions. I'm doing my best to scroll through as many as possible. So please bear with me. Again, because there are so many questions on wages and salary structuring, I will definitely organize a separate sessions, but more or less everything is bordering around similar patterns. Can you elaborate on gig workers? Essentially, for the first time, there is a definition that have been given to what is a gig worker, who is a platform worker, what is a platform. There is an attempt to also kind of bring them under some kind of unemployment protection, health protection, old age protection, and social security protection. So there is an attempt. The nitty-gritties and the details of it is something that we have to watch out for. If you ask my personal opinion, I personally feel it's too premature for India to legislate the gig environment, where US is still struggling, or rather California is still struggling to get AB5 implemented. But then it's good that at least there is an acknowledgement that gig workers are an important part of the employment, a livelihood ecosystem. And it's definitely, it's getting defined and acknowledged is in itself a good move. If you ask me who is a gig worker, again, that's scope in itself for another webinar, but a gig worker is somebody who is, doesn't have an employer-employee relationship, is able to offer their skill, time as a service to whoever is the highest bidder. Sorry, Anil, you asked some question on retrenchment or layoff. I'm sorry, I've not been able to come to that. I'm happy to arrange a separate session on contract labor. Essentially, that will be a session on OSH, the code. Employer compensation policy, is it mandatory or is it a statutory requirement for white collar employees? I think these are again wage thresholds and coverage under ESIC, which determines whether a person needs to be covered under employee compensation or not. It is, that coverage is distinct from whether that person is covered by under any GMC or GPA policy. Maheshwaran, you want to elaborate that more?
Can I get the question, please? Is
employee compensation policy mandatory? Is mandatory?
Policy or compensation is mandatory. Policy is the employer wants to protect his financial risk and all that. So he goes in for a policy shifting the risk to the insurance company. So compensation is mandatory even for white collar assignments.
No, is this talking about the EC?
Yeah, employees compensation. Yes, it's
no, employee compensation. Is this?
Yeah, it's included in the Social Security Code.
Okay. What if we do not have any permanent worker and engaging the contract workers as fixed term contract worker? Then what would be the wages paid to the contract workers? For the minimum wages are applicable. Then depends on the skill that the person brings to the table and what is the applicable minimum wages for that particular skill. So that essentially is how it's going to be. We do not yet know what are the national minimum wage thresholds zone-wise. So I can't really comment on the amount that you have indicated. Of course, your ability to hire is going to be determined by the demand and supply of resources. If gratuity or wages not paid for fixed term employees not paid by contractor, will principal employer be liable for same? Yes. They are liable for same, while the primary responsibility of payment is with the contractor. But if the contractor fails to pay those, then it is the responsibility of the principal employer. Suppose a person is working under contract in unskilled category for 3 years or more in the same establishment, whether he can claim for permanent employment with the employer. If the person has been on fixed term contract for that period of 3 years, and that is agreed through by way of a clearly laid out appointment contract, then no, one cannot. Again, Maheshwaran, pitch in if you think it's any different.
I'll answer that question.
Will the new 5 years license of code under CLRA supersede the earlier labor license of 1 year? Yes.
Yes, yes. All the old licenses can be surrendered to the department.
And the new license for 5 years?
A new license will be applicable throughout the country. It can be surrendered to the respective authority issuing the license.
What is the fixed term employee you said in case of gratuity? Essentially, if you are having fixed term employees, they have to be paid gratuity on a pro rata basis, unlike how you pay employees who have open-ended employment contracts with you. Will gratuity obligation apply in respect of all temporary workers? Is temporary worker a fixed term employee with the meaning of the code? Gratuity obligations are applicable to all workers, which is a person with open-ended contract, fixed term employees, as well as contract employees. Ideally, a contract labor should be hired or deployed on fixed term contract. I don't know whether it answers all your questions or not. As the limit of workers is increased to 50 from 20 in case of Contract Labor Act, what about the existing license holder who have less than 50 workers? Should they comply with the procedures or need not? If you have less than 50, you need not. And there is going to be no CLRA anymore, which is Contract Labor Abolition, Regulation and Abolition Act. It's all part of the OSH code. POSH Act is kept outside the purview of any of these 4 codes. Maheshwaran, I'm reading out this question. See if you can give a specific answer. So the existing Form 5 under CLRA and Form 4 and 5 of construction and building works continue in the code, or is there any change as per new rules? My assessment is that you have to surrender your current licenses and you have to procure fresh licenses based on the new guidelines.
These codes provide for issue of location-specific licenses as well as national licenses. So the rules will be made accordingly. There will be certain forms introduced for the national license as well as the location-specific license. So when the contractor requires location-specific license, he approaches the principal employer to give a registration certificate. So the principal employer may also give Form 5 in that case. So the contractor applies location-specific license. That's how it will be, the rules will be finally framed as we understand from the codes.
Okay, Jagannath, you have a long question, so but it's an important one. Hence, I know we are now crossing our time limit, but I'll take a few more questions, maybe a couple more. And then I will request you all to email us your questions. We will leave an ID with you through which you can interact with us. There are companies covered under under central acts like banks, telecom, and others. Do compliance under states, acts, rules, inspections are also carried by different authorities. Also within the second category, central acts like PF and others, under state like shops and establishment, labor welfare, etc. Inspections are carried out by different authorities. Under the revised code, are these authorities likely to be merged? All the, I think all the acts which have been subsumed under the specific labor codes, there is constant reiteration that there will be a single authority, and which is a big relief. However, our reading is that with PF and ESIC, the current authorities continue to play a role. That of course is a room for improvement in the future versions of the code. Ideally, how it should look is that there should be only one social security that everybody pays. Even the segregation of PF and ESIC in future should be done away with. However, it is what it is. The way we have read the act, in any case, there is a much reduced number of authorities right now. In most cases, there's a single authority for each code. Labor welfare will be a separate authority because labor welfare has not been subsumed under any of the labor codes. So it is a standalone code, which I think I pointed out is one of the challenges. So that is what it is currently. Okay, and now I saw, Anil, your question. Does any establishment can lay off its workers and employees? No, it's not that you cannot lay off without any prior permission, just under any circumstances. If you are laying off people less than 300 in number, you don't need government permission. If it's more than 300 or more, then you need government permission before you proceed on that path. What is the ratio of permanent and contractual employee? There is no such ratio that has been specified. But I have to watch out for the rules to see details further on that. Yes, I think Jitendra, your question has already been responded. Contract workers are included in the threshold limit of 300 in case of layoffs. On migrant worker, there is a question, does it mean that a migrant worker earning more than 18,000 per month will not be? Yes, that's, now that question on whether it's excluding HRA, I'll have to get back to you, but from whatever I have read gross wages of 18,000 and more, 18,000, more than 18,000 are not considered as migrant workers. Maheshwaran, if you have any addition to that, you can share. Okay, I'm sorry. I had to share with you guys the list of non-core. Let me just pull it up for you. Sorry, occupational safety. For example, from what I remember, I think no, let me not hazard a guess. I'll just read it out for you. Somewhere handy. Yeah, sorry. Okay, just to share with you, sanitation work, including sweeping, cleaning, then watch and ward services, including security services, canteen, catering, loading, unloading operation, running of hospitals, educational training institute, guest houses, clubs, courier services, civil and other construction work, including maintenance, gardening and maintenance of lawns, housekeeping and laundry services, transport services, including ambulance services, any activity of intermittent in nature, even if that constitutes a core activity of an establishment, and any other activity which is incidental to the core activity. Okay. Okay, good. I think I'm sorry, but we do have a lot of questions and we are running out of time. And I'm so thankful that all of you have taken 90 minutes of your busy schedule in the current environment to talk to us and to interact with us. And I think we've just shared a link, a Google link, on which you can actually share with us all your questions, the questions that we've not been able to respond. So please fill up that form and we will get back to as many of you as possible with a response. Hope that works for you. And I've taken all your inputs on and suggestions on some of the future sessions that we need to do. So we will definitely do one on wage structuring and compensation structure. We will, something else, I don't know which is the other one we thought we could do. On the OSH code. Definitely we'll do work on a separate session for each of these. So thank you so much. Hope you had, hope this was useful. There were many questions on sharing the link for this video and decks. I think all of you will get the link. And as you can see that if you get the link, you'll get the presentation automatically along with it. So thank you so much. And if at any point, any one of us at TeamLease can be of any help and guidance, please do reach out to us. This is just the beginning of our reform agenda. This is definitely not the end. In my view, I think the next wave of reform has to be on the state side. We also have to look at how we can democratize employment data. I also feel that there is room for change and rationalization in the Social Security Code. At the moment, it is a cut-paste of the earlier acts, and there is definitely some room for improvement there. But anyway, I think this is, it's been a good journey with the government, because the government at the moment, or the team in Ministry of Labor, is willing to listen and engage. And I'm hopeful, as long as we don't sit still, we will see incremental progress in the labor ecosystem. Thank you so much.